I thought my marriage was unbreakable until that day when I came home early and found my wife in bed with my friend. In that moment, my world shattered, and all the trust and love evaporated. Looking back, now I can't trace the path of my life to a series of moments that seemed insignificant. At the time, I was raised in a small town where everyone knew everyone else, and your name carried weight. My father ran an aluminum smelting company, and my mother was a school teacher together. They taught me about perseverance and the value of hard work. I carried those lessons with me, even when life veered off course. After high school, I left my small town, eager to find my place in the world. College wasn't in the cards for me, so I joined a local construction crew. I liked the rhythm of the work, the way sweat and effort could create something tangible. But what I really wanted was stability, a family of my own. I'd always imagined a life filled with love and laughter, a home where I could build something meaningful beyond just walls and floors. Emily came into my life at a time when I was searching for something more. She was beautiful and bold with a wit that sliced through even the toughest days. We met at a friend's barbecue, and from the moment she smiled at me, I was hooked. We got married quickly, maybe too quickly, but I believed in us. I thought we could weather any storm. Looking back, I see now how naive I was. My name is David Carter, and for years, one date haunted me. April 20th, 2010. That day changed everything. I arrived home earlier than planned from a work trip, only to walk into a nightmare. My wife of 6 years, Emily, was in our bed with Jake Thompson, a man whose presence I could barely tolerate on a good day. While it was painful, discovering her affair wasn't completely surprising. Emily had seemed unhappy for a while, unhappy with me, and with our life. The financial crash had only made things worse. We bought our house right before the recession, and now we were underwater on the mortgage. Emily had been wanting out, and I thought it was just a rough patch. But the worst part was that she pushed for the house in the first place. And now, she was complaining about the mortgage since Christmas when she was upset over the gifts I gave her. Emily had been impossible to please. The only bright spot in my day was seeing our daughter, Sophie. She always lit up when I came home. It was a relief compared to the coldness I got from Emily. I'm not sure why I married Emily. It was a mistake from the start. We were both coming off failed relationships, and we just got married because that's what everyone else did. But looking back, none of those reasons held any real meaning. The marriage was rocky at first. I grew to love her when Sophie was born. I thought our bond had only gotten stronger. But now, I wonder if Emily was just a great actress or a master manipulator. Until last year, I thought our life was good. Strong relationship, good family. But I was wrong. I told Emily I'd be home Thursday, but I showed up Wednesday. She worked mornings and Sophie was at school, so I decided to take a chance. I saw an unfamiliar car outside, and when I walked in, I heard noises from the bedroom. It wasn't subtle. I didn't need to sneak. I stood there long enough to take a few pictures on my phone. I wasn't angry at first, just deeply sad. Our marriage was over, and I knew there was no coming back from this betrayal. My life was about to fall apart. The financial strain was bad, but it would only get worse. I'd lose time with Sophie, and I'd never share closeness with Emily again. But when Emily saw me, instead of apologizing, she screamed, "What the hell are you doing home early?" "Charlie." I lost it. I grabbed her by the hair and yelled, "You're an idiot. You're in my bed with him, and you're asking why I'm home early." I didn't even notice Jake behind me until it was too late. He called emergency. When the police arrived, we were still shouting. Jake wrapped in a sheet, met them at the door, and they rushed into the bedroom. I was arrested for pulling Emily's hair. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. I hadn't heard her. It took me a few days to come up with Polly, and by then, Emily had taken Sophie and emptied our accounts. I came home to an empty house. The next week, when I went to work, a bath was waiting for me. accusing of misuse. I countered with infidelity, but it didn't matter. The court sided with her, giving her custody of Sophie and ordering me to pay alimony and child support. After selling their house, my credit was ruined, but I still had my job. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Everything else felt shattered. If it weren't for Sophie, I probably would have left town. At least I was cleared of the attack charges. But it didn't change anything. Most nights, I found myself at Johnny's tavern, listening to drunks talk about how they'd never let their wives cheat. They'd laugh and tell me I wasn't a real man for letting another guy steal my wife. After hearing that too many times, I started going to a different bar one night. As I left Johnny's, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was judging me at work. My colleagues either eyed me or treated me like I was pathetic. I began to consider the revenge talk. I'd heard from those drunks about how I should get back at the two of them for ruining my life. One Sunday, I had Sophie for the day, and we decided to visit my parents after dinner. Sophie went to her room to watch TV and my parents joined me at the kitchen table for coffee. I wasn't planning on opening up, but something about that moment made me. I told them I felt powerless and needed to do something to feel like a man. Again, my dad, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, was the first to speak. "Are you thinking about revenge, Charlie?" he asked. "I'm not sure, Dad. I just can't do nothing," I replied. He put down his cup and looked at me. "Revenge is tricky. It might feel good at first, but it usually leaves you emptier. You get your revenge, and then their friends come after you. It's a cycle." I respected my dad's wisdom, but in that moment, I wasn't in the mood to listen. I wasn't about to look weak. "Charlie, if you go after them, I'll be very disappointed. Let it go. Violence just makes things worse." A few weeks later, everything aligned. One night after leaving the diner, I saw Emily and Jake across the street. They were leaving a restaurant, sharing a kiss, then got in at Alexis as it pulled away. Emily's head dropped into Jake's lap. I stormed to my old Chevy and pounded the steering wheel. Once I calmed down, I started the car and drove off, telling myself I was being smart about it, planning every detail. A few weeks later, I tracked Jake down and caught him alone at night. I struck his ribs with a baseball bat, making sure not to seriously harm him, but to cause him discomfort. I broke his leg and severed his arm before hearing someone shout from a house nearby, "Stop." "I've called the cops," panicked. I threw the bat, my jacket and mask into a dumpster. When I picked up Sophie next, Emily confronted me, asking if I attacked Jake. I just smirked, saying nothing, enjoying the uncertainty I'd left her in. Of course, the cops started questioning me, but I denied everything, claiming I had been home alone. The bat was never found, but a drunk from Johnny's tavern testified, lying about me, bragging about the attack. The cops and Daw pressed charges for aggravated attack and attempted homicide. I was stuck with a public defender, and although the DA's case relied on circumstantial evidence and false testimony, it was enough. At trial, I was acquitted of attempted homicide, but found guilty of aggravated attack. I got 5 years in prison, but there was some relief. Jake, injuries weren't as bad as they seemed. Then on October 16th, I met my new cellmate, Mark Stevens. Raw and young. I wasn't gay, but in prison, your options are limited. Rod and his Aryan gang wouldn't let me live peacefully unless I complied. It was simple: submit or die. 6 months later, my mom visited. She told me Emily had married Jake and moved to Texas. They wouldn't let my parents see or talk to Sophie. My mom tried to reach Emily's mother, but she just laughed. "Cruelty runs in their family," she said. I told my mom I never cheated on Emily. She's the one who did this. I'm working with a prison attorney. Maybe the judge will let me see Sophie again. By the end of the visit, my mom started to soften. She promised to visit again, but we didn't discuss the darker parts of prison life. I won't go into all 5 years. I didn't change much. I didn't use my time to better myself. I spent my first year lifting weights, channeling my anger toward Ron, Emily, and Jake. By the end, I was a solid 110 pounds, my 61 and frame hardened by rage a year in. Ron got a new cellmate, Kevin Johansson. I was moved out in to defend for myself. The first time, two guys came after me. They ended up in the hospital and I was sent to solitary for a month. Unfortunately, my first parole hearing was that same month and wasn't postponed. 2 years later, I stood before the parole board again. After about 20 minutes, I lost my temper when one panel member asked why I hadn't apologized for mistreating my ex-wife. All the bitterness I'd bottled up exploded. I was married to Emily for 6 years. I never touched her, but she had an affair in our bed. The only thing I did was attack him, out of weakness, and that's why I'm here in prison. I had to fight for survival, for my dignity. The justice system let her accuse me of misuse, take everything, and keep me from seeing my daughter. How is that justice? Unsurprisingly, I served my full sentence for 5 years. I heard nothing from Sophie. My efforts to regain contact with her went nowhere. I didn't learn much in prison, except how to scam people online. When I got out, I worked at a warehouse unloading trucks. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy. Meanwhile, I created an online identity for Amy Carson, a widow, raising money for an animal shelter. Through her fake website, Sadar Furry Friends, I collected donations and sold stolen credit card info. Within 2 months, I made 21. Zero enough to move forward with my post-prison plans. I needed to feel alive again. So I decided to go all in. I'd been without a woman for over 6 years, and was desperate for the experience. Armed with a medical certificate and 700 to a bar when I met Candy's suit. I was taken aback by her beauty. "Charlie," she said, with a smile. "Why the pants?" I asked, noticing she wasn't wearing a skirt. "Because tonight I'm spending it with a man who paid $6+ it," she replied, grinning. I wasn't bothered by the fact that Candy had a prosthetic leg, even if some clients had asked for discounts. I ordered a drink and sat beside her. Soon, I noticed a guy staring at me, but I kept calm. He offered to buy me a drink, but I politely declined, telling him I was waiting for someone. Candy put a hand on my shoulder, signaling me to stay composed. I stood up, handed the guy a 20 and said, "I appreciate the offer, but I'll take care of my companion's drink." Sure. He saw the scars on my hands from years in prison. After a tense moment, he took the 20 and walked off, saying, "Enjoy your evening." Candy smiled. "Thanks for handling. That could have gotten ugly." I raised an eyebrow. "How do you stay so calm?" Candy grinned. "It's too soon to talk about me. Let's focus on having a good time tonight." The bartender gave me a free drink. "It's on the house," he said, nodding. "I appreciate how you handled that situation. Had a fight last week, cost me $4 to fix the damage." I raised my glass in thanks and sipped it, slowly, feeling the warmth spread after finishing our drinks. Candy and I walked outside. "I've got a room next door," I said. "Want to grab something to eat before we head up?" "No, maybe later. Or Chinese, or Chinese," she replied casually. "It's all on you," I said with a grin, leading her toward the hotel. In the elevator, I couldn't stop smiling. Candy looked up at me, curious. "What'd she ask?" I smiled wider. "You're just incredible." We entered the room and it didn't take long for things to heat up. Afterward, we collapsed into bed, resting for a bit. That was unexpected, I admitted, catching my breath. Candy glanced at me with a playful smile. "What was?" "I didn't think it would be that good, and I sure didn't expect you to enjoy it so much," I said, still a bit stunned. Candy chuckled. "Well, I am a professional," she said with a teasing laugh. But there was no judgment in her voice. Aside, "I've never paid for this before. I always assumed someone who did this for a living would be, you know, a little more distant. Like they'd be faking it. But you weren't faking anything." "Thanks," she said softly, her tone warming. "You want to order?" Now we settled on Chinese food. And while we waited, we both showered as I stood there. I noticed Candy's prosthetic leg, now up close and personal. It was just below the knee, made of metal. I couldn't help but stare, fascinated by it. "Does it bother you?" she asked, sensing my gaze. I shrugged, looking up at her. "No, not at all. Honestly, it's amazing. I didn't even notice when we were walking here. You didn't limp or anything." She smiled, a hint of pride in her voice. "I get that a lot. It's just a part of me now." Later, we made love again, then lay in bed together. The next morning after another shower, Candy caught me eyeing her prosthetic leg. Again, "It was a motorcycle accident," she said, her voice calm as though she'd answered this question. "Hey, one time's your leg?" I asked, still surprised. "Everyone asks," she replied, almost in a detached tone. "You were polite enough not to. But now you're curious." I nodded. "How did it happen?" She sighed. "I was with this guy, Randy. He bought a new bike and wanted to show off. Thought he was some kind of expert. I was dumb enough to get on the back. He tried to impress me by speeding up. Lost control. Then we crashed. I lost my leg." "What happened to Randy?" I asked. "He didn't wear a helmet." "Another stupid choice. He damaged his head on a lamp post. He was at a coma for a week, before they turned off the machines. He didn't make it." Candy's voice softened, but there was still a coldness to it. "I guess I should feel sorry for him. But he's the reason I'm like this. He had no insurance, didn't cover my medical bills, and now I'm stuck paying for it all. So yeah, I'm a little bitter." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "The worst part was when my parents found out what I was doing," she continued. "They disowned me. I became a hoe in their eyes." I looked at her, my tone growing more serious. "There are worse things than being paid for." "ZX though?" She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Like what, like my ex-wife?" I said, the bitterness in my voice impossible to hide. I then shared the story of Emily with Candy. By the time I finished, she was in agreement. My ex was a piece of work, even worse than her. That made me laugh, though it was the first time I'd found any humor in the whole mess. "Are you hungry?" I asked. "Let me buy you breakfast." "That sounds great," she said with a smile. "But then I've got to run to class." She paused for a moment before adding, "I'm not going to do this forever, being a promiscuous for a living. It's not my plan for the long run." I looked at her, hearing the finality in her words. "You know, people talk about guys falling in love with women like you, and with someone like you. I get it. But let's be realistic here. You're a co-rain. Even if you weren't, what could I offer you? What could I offer any woman?" The next day, I moved on to the second part of my plan. I met up with Juan Price at a diner downtown. One was an outside contact for major black prison gang. After a brief negotiation, we agreed on a price, $15.50, with a condition: when he cut the man's throat, the names would be whispered into his ear. Mine and Johansson's. Jem wasn't the kind of guy to mess around. He'd been accused of things, but never convicted, and I trusted him to keep his word. "I heard about what went down inside," he said, his voice calm. "I can't blame you for wanting revenge." "It's not revenge," I corrected him. "It's justice." Nodded, but there was an edge in his voice when he mentioned Ron Young, the man who had been the catalyst for all this. Johansson didn't deserve. What happened to him? After a year of being Young's playmate, he ended up dead. Rumor has it, Ron held his head too long, strangled him. Johansson deserved better after Johansson died. Young was thrown in solitary for 2 months and charged for not reporting it. I added, "But that's the gist of it. Well, the reason HEK as good as dead. You don't have to worry about that," Jan said, his tone darkening. "Our deal stays between us." "Understood," I replied, locking eyes with him. Jen nodded and left without saying another word. I hadn't lasted 5 years in prison by running my mouth for days after the prison riot that claimed the lives of 4 inmates. Word spread that area Mark Stevens, Ron Young, had been fatally stabbed, setting off the violence. The suspect in the homicide was eliminated in the chaos that followed, and the prison was shut down for 3 days. As a result, meanwhile, my little online venture with the Amy Carson website had run its course. I pulled the plug on it before law enforcement could catch wind and start digging into it. Honestly, the whole thing had become insignificant. The amount of money invested was too small for anyone to bother investigating. My focus was now on finding Sophie. Emily's Facebook had vanished 2 years ago, with the last post showing their family in front of Disneyland. Sophie had just turned 9, smiling happily with Emily and Jake, and then silence out of curiosity. I typed Jake Thompson into Google. Imagine my surprise when I found out he was living in Chicago. There was no trace of Emily, but at least I had a lead. It cost me zero money. I earned through less than legal means to hire a private investigator. He dug up the info. Jake no longer lived with Emily, and he had a job in the city. He also had certain hangouts afterward. It didn't take long for Jake to recognize me when I slid onto the bar stool beside him. It was hard not to. My appearance had changed drastically since the last time he saw me back during my sentencing. Was when I'd left him a bloody mess with a Louisville slugger with my muscular frame, broken nose, and shaved head. I must have looked pretty intimidating. Jake studied me warily before asking, "Are we going to have a problem?" I'd anticipated this moment before approaching him. I'd already prepared my response. "No," I replied, shaking my head. Jake, hitting me with a baseball bat was a mistake. That mistake had cost me 5 years of my life, the hell of prison, and the chance to watch my daughter grow up. I wasn't about to waste any more time clinging to the past. "I came to ask you one thing." I continued, my voice steady. "Do you know where Sophie is?" Jake looked at me for a second before answering his voice. "Come, I tell you, if I did." Emily had left me for another man, and the 3 of them had vanished. I could tell from my something I'd learned to read during my time behind that he was telling the truth. Prison teaches you that eyes are the windows to the soul. Then, Jake spoke again. "I need to say something. Charlie, I shouldn't have gotten involved with Emily when she was still married to you," he began. "It was wrong. I really loved her, and I thought she loved me. It hurt when she dumped me for that other guy. That's where I understood how you must have felt. When we started talking, she fed me a pack of lies that I didn't catch on to until later. She told me you misused her, and Sophie said your marriage was a joke, that it would either end in divorce or end in life. I thought I was the knight in shining armor. And when you beat the hell out of me, well, it just confirmed what Emily had told me." Jake paused to take a swig of his beer, then looked at me with more sincerity. "I want you to know something else. I didn't agree with Emily cutting you and your family out of Sophie's life. I thought it was a huge mistake, but she insisted I'd back off. Sophie wasn't my kid, and I had I had a good relationship with her. I loved her, but I was never her father. And Sophie missed you." Charlie, hearing him say that nearly broke me, but I forced myself to hold it together. My eyes welled up, but I didn't want Jake to see that. Jake turned to the bartender asking for a pen and paper. After scribbling something down, he handed it to me. "I don't know where they ended up," Jake said, his tone low, "but this is the guy who took my place. Ryan Davis. He's a carpenter, working for a real estate developer in Plano. Chase Holmes. Stewart was working on homes just a block from our house. I don't know how he met Emily, but the first time I knew about him was the day she packed up his truck and left. I didn't even realize what was happening until a neighbor called to ask why Emily was loading stuff into a truck. I got home just as they were leaving. We argued, and then the cops showed up. That's when I recognized the name in his work. The cops didn't detain them, and they drove off later. I found a note in the kitchen. Just said goodbye. Our accounts were drained. I spent thousands trying to find her, but nothing came of it. A year later, I sued her for infidelity and abandonment, sold the house and moved here. There was bitterness in Jake's voice as he finished, and I could hear the grudge. He still held against both Emily and me. I just wanted to see my daughter. He added quietly. I thanked Jake for the information, bought him another drink and left the bar, feeling uncertain about my next move. Jake had spent thousands searching for Emily, so why would I waste my limited resources doing the same thing? But there was one person who likely knew where Emily and Sophie were, and that was Emily's mother. It would be a risk. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. If I got caught, I'd be back in prison, but I couldn't think of any other way. Linda Parker was a creature of habit, a woman who didn't change every Sunday. She went to church at 900 and she always left a spare key hidden in the faux stone by the patio door. She probably thought her Rottweiler, Brutus, was all the security she needed. At 902, I climbed over the fence from the alley behind her house. The key was exactly where it should be, so I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The distance, the low growl echoed through the kitchen, a sound that would have sent most people running, but not me. Brutus rounded the corner and spotted me standing there, and in a moment of recognition, he reared up on his hind legs and licked my face. 6 years had passed since he'd last seen me, but that didn't seem to matter. He remembered the man who had adopted him from the shelter, trained him to sit, stay and come, and had given him treats every time I visited Linda's house. While Brutus was busy reacquainting himself with my face, I casually walked over to the counter and grabbed a dog treat from the cookie jar that Linda always kept there. I tossed it onto the floor and Brutus eagerly scrambled to snatch it up. I used the brief moment to look around. The kitchen hadn't changed at all since the day John Parker passed away 9 years ago. The same cluttered desk, the same old bills and the same computer where Linda paid her bills. I sat down at the desk and turned on the computer. A password prompt appeared on the screen. After a moment's thought, I typed in John 316, and the machine powered up while the computer was booting. I rifled through a few drawers and found some letters, each with return addresses. One of them confirmed Emily's new address in El Paso. I slipped a flash drive into the USB port and copied over Linda's photo folder, her video files, and emails. I grabbed everything I needed, powered down the computer, patted Brutus on the head and quietly left the house, making sure to lock the door and replace the key that Sunday. I spent the day watching old videos and photos of Sophie. She had grown so much, and it hit me hard how beautiful she had become. I felt like such a fool for missing all those years. From the letters and emails, I learned that Emily and Sophie were living under the name Parker. Now, though they weren't married to Ryan Davis, the man Emily had left me for Sophie was in 5th grade. By Monday, I had handed all the information I gathered along with a 5 retainer to a private investigator in El Paso. He confirmed that the address and details were current Tuesday afternoon. I found myself standing at my parents' door. Had been years since I'd seen my father, the last time being at my sentencing. He had looked at me with nothing but sorrow and pain that day. Now I stood on the other side of the door, wondering if he'd let me in high. "Dad," I said. He opened the door and pulled me into a tight hug. He looked me squarely in the eyes and then embraced me again, as if making sure I was real Mary. "Charlie's home," he called out. Mom appeared from the kitchen and wrapped me in her arms as well. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please," I replied. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd eaten countless meals as a kid. The familiarity of it all hit me hard. Linda Parker wasn't the only one who thrived on routine. "Mom, Dad, I owe you both an apology," I began, my voice thick with regret. "I've let you down. I should have listened to you. I should have known better than to let a bunch of losers talk me into seeking revenge." Mom walked over and hugged me tightly, while Dad gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. "I found out where Emily and Sophie are," I continued, "and I need your help to get back in touch with her. I've got enough to make a trip to El Paso and hire a lawyer. I need your support to at least get visitation rights. Will you help me?" Dad answered first, his voice heavy with caution. "What exactly are you planning to do? This isn't going to turn violent again, is it?" The question stung. But I understood. My past actions had made him wary. No, I reassured him. I'm consulting a lawyer first. I've done my time. I'm no longer on parole, so I have the right to petition for visitation. But let's face it, I'm an ex-convict. I think it would help if you both came with me and we filed together. I'd rather not go alone. Dad exchanged a look with Mom, and I saw their silent conversation without a word from her. He gave the faintest nod. When do we leave? He asked. Can you be ready in a week? I need to wrap up some things at work and take care of a few errands. Can we use your car? Mom asked. We can need it once we get there. Sure, I replied. I'll take it to the shop tomorrow to get it ready. We'll leave Monday. Sound good with that? So, I drank another cup of coffee and we fell into some light conversation, catching up on family gossip. It's felt comforting to be back in my parents' home again. In the days that followed, I used my free time to research the best family lawyers in El Paso. After reading some great reviews, I called to make an appointment for Thursday. That gave us 3 full days to drive there with an extra day for rest. My parents, especially Mom, who was a huge Matthew and CCY fan, agreed we should leave Sunday to break up the long 5-mile drive. And so on Sunday, I set out on the road with Mom and Dad at 36. I found myself once again in the backseat of Dad's car heading for a Sophie tie-in. That would change everything as we passed through town. Dad reminisced about his own road trips. He told us how, when he was just 3 years old, his family had driven Route 66 to Los Angeles back. Then, it wasn't tall freeways, just 2-lane roads, and you couldn't drive more than for a day. It took them 7 days to get to California. My grandfather had hoped for a fresh start after the war, but my grandmother had been homesick. So, they ended up moving back to Rhine, Wisconsin. Dad's father had eventually become the CEO of an aluminum smelting company. He'd been successful until a heart attack took him at 58. I had never met him, but Dad said he had named me after him, and that's why I'd been given his name over the 4 days we spent on the road. Mom and Dad told me stories from the past stories I had either forgotten or never paid much attention to growing up. I had left home when I was 18 and it had been years since we'd spent this much time together. The last family vacation I remembered was when I was 14 on a road trip to Washington, D.C. On Thursday afternoon we sat in Glass Harbor's office, a far cry from my past experiences with the law. This time, things felt different, positive. Even I laid everything out for the lawyer. My conviction, my prison sentence, how Sophie and I were kept apart, how my parents suffered the same fate. I shared the details of my divorce from Emily, her marriage to Jake, and my own divorce from him. When me Jake suing for infidelity and child abandonment. Miss Harper's interest peaked. It didn't paint me in a flattering light, but it certainly didn't make Emily look like a saint either. The moment my mother broke down, unable to hold on to her granddaughter, any remaining reluctance on the lawyer part vanished. I paid her deposits and she immediately began preparing the necessary paperwork. All we had to do now was wait. We decided not to stay in El Paso over the weekend. Instead, we headed to Big Bend National Park, though our minds were still occupied with the legal matters in El Paso. Despite everything, we were able to enjoy the park's peaceful beauty along the Rio Grande. 4 days later, Miss Harper called to inform us that we needed to meet her on Tuesday morning to prepare for a hearing before a judge. Tuesday afternoon Gladys Harper was in full swing. She had even secured a signed statement from Jake Thompson, confirming that Emily had ended their relationship and cut off his connection to Sophie. Jake, however, had made one stipulation that Sophie be told he hadn't abandoned her and still loved her. We reconvened in the courthouse lobby heading toward the judge's office. It didn't take long to realize that Miss Harper and the judge had a solid working relationship. We answered the judge's questions, and then Miss Harper made it clear that at this stage, we were only seeking a preliminary meeting with Sophie to re-establish contact. She suggested having a court-appointed social worker accompany us. Miss Harper also emphasized that due to Emily's previous actions in preventing the Signs from seeing Sophie, and later doing the same with Jake. We asked that Emily not be notified of the meeting. She would likely try to delay and manipulate Sophie further. I couldn't believe it. When the judge granted our request and scheduled the meeting for the next day, we were to pick up Sophie from school, with the court order in hand, accompanied by Miss Harper and a social worker. We had 3 hours to speak with Sophie at a local cafe, and then return her home. Stepping out of the courthouse into the bright Texas sun, I felt lighter than I had in years. It took all my willpower not to hug Miss Harper on the spot. She assured me that she was already working on the follow-up paperwork to establish visitation rights for me and my parents. "We'll meet tomorrow at 145, she said. "The social worker will go with you to the school. Once you pick up Sophie, I'll step back and the social worker will stay with you until you return Sophie to her home. Don't mess this up. Stay calm, stay sober, and no matter what happens, especially if Sophie's mom causes a scene, stay composed. Expect her to make a scene, especially in front of the social worker that could actually help our case. Treat the social worker like a friend. She might become one when we go back to court. The judge has given us an invaluable opportunity. Don't waste it with that." She left us. I hugged Mom and Dad for all their support. The next 22 hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. We stayed close to the hotel, grabbing a quick meal at a diner across the street. Part of me feared something would go wrong. What if Sophie wasn't at school when we arrived? My parents tried to reassure me, but I could see the same concern in their eyes. The next afternoon, we arrived at Miss Harper's office at 100 p.m. 35 minutes later, a short, stout woman, Miss Marie Hearn, and has introduced herself. She explained her role as a social worker and how she would observe the situation without being intrusive. Clearly read the case files, as she was particularly kind and understanding toward my mother, almost as a fellow grandmother. Miss Hernandez gave a helpful advice on how to approach Sophie, especially after such a long and traumatic separation. I was especially grateful for her guidance, as I was anxious about how Sophie would react to me. We arrived at Sophie's school 30 minutes before dismissal. The principal and vice principal reviewed the court order, consulted with the district office, and spoke with their legal department before agreeing to release Sophie into our custody. 10 minutes before the bell rang, Sophie was brought to the vice principal's office. The first person she saw was my mother, and Sophie's face lit up with recognition. She rushed into my mom's arms. My mom dropped to one knee, hugging her tightly and crying openly. When Sophie saw my father approaching, she cried out, "Daddy." As a child, she had mispronounced Grandpa, and the name stuck. Daddy scooped Sophie up into his arms, kissing her on the nose, and Sophie turned her gaze toward me. Her hesitant daddy showed just how much I had changed since the last time we saw each other. It was exactly as Mrs. Hernand had advised. Let Sophie reconnect with her grandparents first, as they still looked the same and shared a unique bond with her. I knelt down, arms wide, silently praying that Sophie would accept my hug to my relief. She did, throwing herself into my arms. Our reunion was abruptly interrupted when the vice principal walked in with Emily, who had been waiting in the school parking lot to pick up Sophie. Emily looked around the room, furious. "What the hell is going on? What are you doing here? Leave Sophie alone," she shouted. Miss Harper stepped forward, handing Emily a copy of the court order. "Miss Parker, this court order grants Sophie's father and grandparents the right to visit with her today for 3 hours. They will be accompanied by Mrs. Hernandez to ensure Sophie's safety and that they return her to you within that time." Emily barely glanced at the papers before tossing them aside. "I don't care what these papers say. You can't just show up and take my daughter. Those people have no business here. She's my daughter." Emily lunged towards Sophie, but Sophie instinctively hid behind my mom. Mrs. Hernandez immediately stepped in front of Emily, recognizing the shift in the situation. "Miss Parker," Mrs. Hernandez said firmly, "do you want me to call the police? If you keep this up, I guarantee you'll be arrested and held until you calm down and stop threatening people." The tension in the room was thick, But at least it felt like the first real step toward getting Sophie back at that moment. The assistant principal stepped in, trying her best to calm Emily down. She ushered Emily into her office, giving us a chance to slip away with Sophie and Mrs. Hernandez. The four of us headed to a small cafe a few blocks from the school, while Mrs. Hernandez sat at a nearby table, keeping an eye on things. Earlier, Mrs. Hernandez had given us some advice on how to approach Sophie. After such a long separation, we followed her suggestions, and I believe it made all the difference. Sophie didn't seem scared, but my heart shattered when she tearfully asked, "Daddy, why didn't you ever call me? Send me letters? Why didn't I ever get birthday cards?" Thankfully, I had anticipated this question. I reached into my mom's purse and pulled out a large manila envelope. "Sophie, I thought about you every single day. We were apart. I sent you cards, postcards and letters. They all came back to me. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Your mom sent them back. She didn't want me or your grandparents in your life." I showed her the envelopes, each stamped, returned to sender with Emily's handwriting on them twice. I hired lawyers to try and get her to let me talk to you. "Why did she do that, Daddy?" Sophie asked, again, confused. I wanted to say because your mother is cruel, but I held my tongue. I took her hand gently and said one day, "You'll have to ask your mom about it, but not today. Let's just talk. Okay? You, me, and your grandparents. We all love you and what's been going on in your life. How's school? Do you play any sports? What are your friends' names?" The 3 hours passed in a blur. We drove to Emily's house, making sure to respect the time limit. When we arrived, Emily was waiting on the porch, cigarette in hand, clearly angry. I pulled up to the curb and before I could even park, Sophie piped up from the back seat, "I want to show you my room." Looking at Emily standing there, I hesitated. "I don't think today a good day for that. Sophie, your mom doesn't seem too happy to have us here, but it's my house, and I should be able to show you my room." Sophie protested, clearly offended. My mom, seeing the situation, gently suggested, "How about you? Show me your room today. Next time we can all see it." Sophie reluctantly agreed. Mrs. Hernandez, who had been quietly observing, said she needed to stay with them. So Mrs. Hernandez and Sophie got out of the car and walked toward the porch. Dad and I stayed behind, unable to hear the conversation clearly, but it was obvious it wasn't a friendly one. Despite Emily's fire demeanor, Mrs. Hernandez was even more imposing. A few minutes later, Mrs. Hernandez and Sophie returned to the car. Emily remained on the porch, glaring at us. We stood there for about 10 minutes, when out of nowhere, two patrol cars pulled up, one in front and one behind us. My heart sank for a brief moment. I feared the worst. Had the hidden room with Mark Young been discovered, was someone finally catching up to me for the fake internet scam? Just as I was about to panic, 4 officers stepped out of the cars. Ryan Davis pulled into the driveway and hurried up to the porch. Mrs. Hernandez was the first to meet the officers at the front door. Dad and I watched as the police cuffed Emily and Ryan. My mind was spinning. What is going on here? "Stay in the car, Charlie," Dad ordered, his voice firm. I wanted to jump out and run toward the scene, but he stopped me. "Let me handle this," he said, not giving me a choice before Dad could even open the door. Mom rushed out of the house and climbed into the back seat of the car. I was dying to ask her what had happened, but I could see the confusion on her face too. "I don't know exactly," she said, shaking her head. Mrs. Hernandez was looking around Sophie's room when she noticed something, a toy on the shelf. She picked it up and asked Sophie some questions, but I couldn't hear everything. After that, she called the police. She told them to come fast, but that's all I know. Just then, Mrs. Hernandez came over to our car. "I'm sorry, but Sophie is coming with me to the station. We need to ask her a few questions. You should call Miss Harper and have her meet us there. Sophie will likely stay with the social services family until everything is sorted out." Sort it out. What's going on? I asked, feeling a sense of dread rising me. We don't know yet, Mrs. Hernandez replied. I don't think Sophie's been hurt, but some things in her room were concerning the police need to investigate. And for now, Sophie will be safe with me. Please, trust me. This is for Sophie's well-being. Call Mrs. Harper. We'll keep you updated. It took 3 long weeks before we learned the full story. Thankfully, thanks to Miss Harper's expertise, things ended in our favor. The toy Mrs. Hernandez found in Sophie's room turned out to be a hidden camera. Once she realized what it was, she immediately contacted the police. The camera was enough to secure a search warrant for Ryan's computer, which revealed everything it turned out. Emily had no idea about Ryan's spying. However, her behavior didn't out matters. At one point, Emily insulted Mrs. Hernandez at school, calling her derogatory names and making hurtful comments about her appearance and ethnicity. That certainly didn't work in her favor. Judge Torres tried to maintain a neutral stance, but Emily's situation only got worse. Miss Harper's efforts ensured that Emily wasn't even granted visitation rights. 2 months after arriving in Texas, Sophie and I were in Dad's car with Sophie, safely buckled in next to Mom. We moved in with my in-laws for nearly a year, following the therapist's advice to ease Sophie into our new life. We even allowed Jake to attend Sophie's 11th birthday party, following the therapist's recommendation that forgiveness was important for Sophie's sake. The hardest part was when Emily moved back to town. We allowed Sophie to visit her mom at her grandmother's house a few times, but things soon took a turn. Emily's mom, Linda, called me one day with troubling news. I don't want to do this, but I have to tell you something, she said, her voice shaky. Emily has been saying horrible things about you, Charlie and Hank. I can't believe the person she's become. It breaks my heart, but I don't want to lose my granddaughter. I think it's best if Emily isn't around Sophie anymore. That was all I needed to hear. I cut off Emily's access to Sophie completely. And in court, she lost all rights to her. The whole situation was revolting, but it was what needed to happen. Emily's reaction was exactly what I expected. She swore, shouted, and threatened everyone, including Sophie and Linda. Her lawyer, embarrassed by her behavior, had to escort her out of the courtroom. Her family life felt like something straight out of a bad reality show. Emily ignored the restraining order showing up at our auto at all hours, even after spending a weekend in jail. She didn't change eventually. When the police failed to deter her, I had to take matters into my own hands. Once again, I sat across from one Price at a diner downtown, leaning on her. He's worth $1,000, 2,000, if you're talking physical impact. 100 if it's permanent, he said, his face serious. I don't want her hurt. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Just walk away. We'll handle it politely. Ask her to leave town. One took the envelope and left without hesitation. 2 weeks later, I wasn't shocked to hear that Emily had returned to Texas, but I was surprised a year later when I learned it. She'd moved back in with Ryan Davis after he was released on parole. The last I had heard from Linda, she and Ryan had been living in Nicaragua after he violated his parole. I ended up talking to Sophie's therapist about Emily. The therapist was careful, stating that it was impossible to diagnose someone without proper evaluation. But based on Haley's actions, it seemed likely she had one or more psychosis. Honestly, I was glad to be rid of her for the foreseeable future. Amid all this drama, I realized I had developed a new marketable skill during my time in prison. My father had invested in me, helping me start a small business. I opened a shop in a local strip mall, offering website design and personal computer repair services. No regular firm would hire a former convict, especially with all the sensitive information they handle. But with my own business, it worked out fine. Very few, if any, of my clients checked my background, and I made sure to play it straight. No shortcuts. I was making around 50 to 60 a year. which was more than enough to cover our apartment rent and take care of Sophie and me. It's been for years now. Over the past 3 years, Sophie has been training with me, running and biking. She's shaping up to be an excellent middle-distance runner. The high school track coach is already keeping an eye on her, and it looks like she'll compete next year as a sophomore. Last Saturday, Sophie and I participated in a fun run at Crystal Lake. A 25M bike ride, followed by a 10K run. We stuck together during the ride, but the last 2 miles, we trailed behind a woman who was pedaling fast. Even though she had a prosthetic leg, Sophie was impressed by how courageous it was for her to compete with such an obstacle. The woman reminded me of Candy. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Her prosthetic leg was different, and her hair was short and brown. I kept my eyes on the road and didn't look at her face as we passed. The memory of Candy made me uncomfortable, especially since I was with my daughter. Not the best time to get sentimental. We switched from bikes to running, and 42 minutes later, as we neared the finish line, a woman passed us, finishing just ahead. Sophie approached her while we caught our breath and introduced herself. The woman stood with her back to me, but smiled, warmly, accepting Sophie's handshake that was amazing. "Thank you," Sophie said. I stayed back, letting them talk. It's just like Sophie to make new friends wherever she goes lately. She's been trying to play match, encouraging me to talk to women she meets. After a few moments, Sophie turned back to me and said, "This is my dad, Charlie Kaza." Then she added, "Dad, this is Rachel Adams." The name hit me like a ton of bricks. Rachel. At first, she didn't recognize me, but when she looked into my eyes, something flashed in her expression. "Nice to meet you." "Rachel, Rachel," I said, shaking her hand. "Dad," Sophie said. I told Rachel we should stop at that place by the river for lunch. Rachel agreed. "Sure. I love that place. We're heading to the Broken Paddle. You know it." Rachel smiled, her expression softening as she remembered. "I think I should let you to have some father-daughter time," she said. "I'll give you a break." "Rachel, that's sweet of you, but we've been spending time together all week," I said, grinning. I think Sophie would enjoy some company with someone closer to her age. I winked. "Please don't disappoint us. Join us." "Are you sure?" she asked, giving me a playful look. "Do I need to beg?" I grinned. "If I don't, well, Sophie will." "Okay. I'll meet you there." Rachel agreed as Sophie and I packed our bikes into the car. I silently hoped Rachel wouldn't back out, but she showed up, and we spent the next half hour at the restaurant while I ate my burger and sipped on a beer. Sophie and Rachel chatted like old friends. Sophie was excited to hear that Rachel had graduated from the Art Institute with a degree in photography. Sophie's favorite museum in Chicago, art, is also her favorite subject at school. I listened in on their conversation, learning that Rachel worked for a marketing company, photographing products for online retail catalogs. Most small shops without in-house photographers hire agencies like Rachel to handle their web content. Their conversation was interrupted when a young man asked Sophie to join him and his friends for being back to us. Sophie turned to us for approval. "Sure," I said. "Go ahead. It'll give me a chance to chat with your dad." Sophie headed off with him, and I kept my eyes on her, glad she was still in sight. "You're going to have your hands full. She's already a beautiful young woman," Rachel said, quietly. "I trust her," I replied. "She's got a good head on her shoulders." "I appreciate you letting me join you today," Rachel continued. "I didn't know what to expect when you recognized me." "I'm glad you recognized me," I said, sighing. "I need to be honest. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. I haven't seen Sophie connect with someone this quickly in a long time. I want you to know something. Rachel, I paused when I was in business before. I didn't react to men the way you did. But when I saw you at that bar and you treated me with respect, it threw me off. Why didn't you call me after that night? I was hoping you would, Rachel said. Softly. I decided to be truthful. I needed to focus on getting Sophie back in my life first. When that turned into me becoming a full-time single parent, I put everything into her and her well-being. And honestly, I just gotten out of prison. It would have been too easy to fall in love with you, especially with how beautiful you are. She looked at me, her voice soft, but questioning. And you didn't want to fall in love with someone like me. I quickly corrected myself. No, I didn't mean it that way. Don't think that I'm sorry. She paused, then asked, Are you still working as an escort? She phrased it gently as if she was tiptoeing around the past. I winced slightly, but she just looked at me with quiet patience. No, she replied, not since I graduated and got a steady job. I have a good income now, with health benefits. I quit the day I was hired. My medical bills are paid, and I even got a new prosthetic leg. I nodded, relieved for her before asking, And how's your family? I remember you were estranged from them for a while. She smiled faintly. You have a good memory. Then her expression softened. Mom and I are talking again. Dad still has a hard time accepting what I did, but he's trying. He'd rather mortgage their house than see me back in that life. But I couldn't do that to them. It's been 3 years since my last date. The more is still hard for him. I think he's starting to forgive me. We spent the rest of the time talking about Sophie and work. When Sophie returned to the table, we got ready to leave. Dad, can Rachel come over for dinner next weekend? Sophie asked, her eyes sparkling. All I could think at that moment was how proud I was of my smart, thoughtful daughter. Little did I know that dinner would be the start of something much more. Rachel and I have been dating for over a year now. I've been thinking about proposing to her soon. Sophie loves her, and the two have become best friends. Before I asked Rachel, this happened while I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. I plan to ask her father for permission. Hopefully, it'll help them reconcile. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. It's been slow going. As for her father, like most men, he wonders why Rachel's past doesn't bother me. Maybe it should, but after talking it out with her, we both agree that fidelity in marriage is non-negotiable. Some might call me a fool for marrying a woman with such a past and allowing her into Sophie's life. But I don't see it that way. 2 years before that race in Crystal Lake, I was dating a nice woman and things were getting serious. Then, one day, she asked me about my missing front teeth. I decided to tell her the full truth about my past, including my run-in with Ron. Young, she didn't take it well, and soon became distant. After a few months, she disappeared from my life completely. It was clear she couldn't accept the things I had done to survive prison. So when things got serious with Rachel, I knew I had to tell her the truth. I told her everything, hoping she'd understand. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, Sometimes we do things we regret to survive, but that doesn't mean we let it define us. You're still Charlie. Clean, a good man, and a loving father. You're who you've always been. If you need to forgive yourself for what happened in prison, she said, softly, start today. She hugged me, and I didn't need to hear anything else. Sometimes the right person's forgiveness is all you need to start. Living a better life has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it? I was standing in my living room, surrounded by laughter and the smell of Sophie's favorite chocolate cake, baking in the oven. Rachel was at the kitchen counter, her prosthetic barely noticeable as she playfully argued with Sophie about which frosting to use. Watching them, I realized something profound. For all the twists, mistakes, and hardships, I'd finally found a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect. Not yet. There were still days when I wrestled with the shadows of my past, but they felt more like distant memories than a weight on my chest. Sophie's accomplishments, her track meets, her art exhibits, became the anchor that kept me grounded. And Rachel, she reminded me That love, when built on trust and shared understanding, could he lead in the deepest wounds later that evening. As the three of us sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Sophie turned to me and said, "Dad, I'm glad you're happy. We deserve this for the first time in years." I believed her. Maybe the road to this moment wasn't easy, but it led me here to a family forged, not by perfection, but by perseverance. And in the end, that was more than enough. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the story, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.